Our next speaker will be Professor George Ogola, who is a professor of media industries on the University of Nottingham. His research interests focus on the intersection between technology, the news, media, and the popular culture and politics. He has published widely in these areas, and we are very glad to have Professor Ogola. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So these are sort of reflections on a paper that I hope to write at some point. And I'm very hopeful that I'll receive sort of some useful feedback from all of you. So nothing is cast in stone here. It's just simply sort of reflections. So my focus really is to look at public health. The COVID crisis within the context of public health communication. Now, I suppose we all agreed at the moment that the pandemic in Africa was as disruptive as it was, politically significant, and that it not only exposed, the fragile health systems, across several countries in the continent. What it also demonstrated was how the responses to the crisis indeed became very political, and in my view, revealing sort of the anxieties of what I call, fragile statehood. So what my paper does really is to explore some of these government responses to the pandemic, as I said, within the context specifically of public health communication. And what I seek to demonstrate is how health messaging was in fact shaped by or through instruments of coercion, turning the pandemic into what I call a political health crisis. Now, as we are all aware, public health communication is very important, during public health emergencies, But Africa's case is fairly unique. The health sector involves a number of actors and stakeholders. So unlike much of the global north, where you look to the government to, of course, communicate issues relating to health, in Africa, we've got national governments, you've got regional administrations, you've got the media, you've got the church. You've got NGOs, you've got development agencies, CBOs. There's so many interest groups, within the health sector. And it is precisely because of that a number of countries do not have sort of integrated and effective public health communication systems, always leading to instances of sort of fragmentation and replication, of efforts, which ultimately sort of undermine not just health messaging, but also lead to poor health outcomes. Now, within the context of the pandemic, what was quite interesting was that the communication, public health communication, was further complicated by what I call sort of a mix of competing framings of the pandemic. So the government framed it in one way, the church framed it in a different way, development agencies framed it differently. So you had sort of this arrestive public, of course, framed it in multiple ways. So you had what I call sort of an information crisis, that created sort of a lot of confusion. So within the context of Africa, when it comes to communication, we're talking about a very complex, communication narrative, that had quite different strands, and all these sort of competing, sides of knowledge were all fighting for, legitimacy one way or another. But it is also precisely because of that competition that I argue that the role of the national government became very important, to almost sort of harness all these sort of competing framings and narratives in shaping sort of the direction of public health messaging around COVID. Now, in a number of countries, not all, but in a number of countries, what happened then was that governments resorted to what Victoria Bernal has called sort of a form of infopolitics, the husbandry of power through the management and control of information. And they did it in two main ways. The first way was through legislation, And the second way was through what I call discursive, statecraft. And I'll explain what that means. So, legislation for information control. Now, we've heard from previous speakers, of course, arguing for and against, public health laws, Indeed, one would argue that, strong public health laws can be very critical, on occasion in ensuring sort of effective responses to public health emergencies. Indeed, it's precisely because of that you have the international health regulations, whose signatories, are pretty much every country sort of in the world. So whenever there is an instance of a potential pandemic, you've got to abide by those particular sort of regulations. Countries are obligated, to do so. And some have indeed argued that, it is because of those public health laws that, perhaps, places like South Korea, Australia, and indeed, we've had the case of Rwanda, managed to contain the pandemic, a lot better. But of course, we also have to recognize other competing explanations for, those successful containment strategies. South Korea, for example, had dealt with SARS, or the Middle East respiratory sort of syndrome. Island nations, on the other hand, fared a lot better precisely because of the fact that they're island nations. So they're different. So it's not just a function of, strict public health laws. It's also a function sort of other variables. But the point I want to make is that, restrictive COVID legislations were not in themselves, wholly unnecessary or indeed inconsistent with the international legal commitments of a number of countries. My problem, however, is that in a number of African countries, we saw a systematic and deliberate sort of derogation from several international conventions, particularly those relating to the Bill of Rights, touching on freedom, fundamental freedoms relating to freedom of information and access to information, in the course of their public health communication sort of responses. So across a number of countries, we saw the passing of legislation that disproportionately, focused on information management and information control. And I have a number of interesting examples here. For example, in Zimbabwe, you had the government pass the Public Health National Lockdown Order, giving it sweeping powers to control public health information and punish those who spread what it called false information about the pandemic. But what was interesting was that false information was actually determined by the state. So it was not determined in law, but it was consistently determined sort of by the state and therefore conveniently used to crack down on dissent and, of course, restrict freedom of expression. In Nigeria, a proposed infectious disease control bill was widely sort of criticized. I'm sure my Nigerian brother will agree. Widely criticized precisely because of the overreach, of some of its provisions. The fact that it was going to stifle freedom of speech and indeed, suppress dissent, defined as those who did not agree with the position that the government took. In Kenya, we also had several COVID-related directives, and legal notices. Of particular relevance to this discussion was the Public Order Act, a colonial-era piece of legislation that is notoriously has been sort of notoriously used by successive governments to clamp down on dissent. We also had it was also actually used to almost sort of militarize the notion of the lockdown. So the lockdowns became curfews. In other words, giving the state, the right to violently, clamp down on protests. And then you had the Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes Act, which criminalizes, the publication of false information online. This was consistently used to delegitimize and criminalize, dissenting views on COVID. And we have to remember the fact that, during COVID, there was sort of this internationally sanctioned war, against, COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation practices, to the extent that whenever, these laws were misapplied, they were not as widely condemned as they should have been, precisely because the whole world was united against, disinformation and misinformation. In Rwanda, Public Order Act, again, gave the state sweeping powers to control public gatherings and, of course, punish those who spread, false information. The restrictions that were instituted also meant that, journalists' movement were also severely restricted. So they were not able to actually cover stories that they were interested in covering, particularly on the negative sort of impact of those particular restrictions. Tanzania, we've had, took a different approach. Magufuli declared the country virus-free, but what he did also was to stop issuing, updates of the number of cases and deaths from COVID-19. Tanzania has very restrictive sort of media laws, okay, that ensure that, force journalists and media houses into self-censorship, of course, fearing reprisal from the state. He was particularly sort of clamped down on online conversations about sort of the pandemic. So there's a gentleman here called Kigogo. He was very well known in Tanzania, was followed by millions of followers. So what Magufuli's government did was to actually work in concert with the big tech companies to shut down, Kigogo's social media accounts. In South Africa, my argument then is that, Africa did not have to go through the way of coercive sort of legislation, because South Africa took a completely sort of different path. In South Africa, rather than come up with legislation that was very restrictive, they actually opted not to declare a state of emergency, but they used what they call sort of disaster management legislation. And that legislation guarantees the protection of the Bill of Rights, the freedom to information, and of course the freedom of expression. So there was an alternative to the restrictive sort of legislation that we saw. The other tool that was used was what I've called sort of discursive sort of statecraft. This is where governments use a multitude of techniques to influence public opinion, through interventions in public discourse. So this was done through three main ways: traditional health strategies, public health strategies that are commonly fairly well known. In the traditional public health campaigns, what happens normally is that you are expected to support those campaigns. You don't contest them, particularly within the context of politically highly regulated sort of societies. Dissent can attract punitive sort of retribution through the invocation of some of the punitive sort of legislation that we've talked about, as was the cases in places such as Rwanda and indeed Uganda. So in Rwanda, you had sort of these awareness campaigns, Guma Marugo campaign, which is a call to stay at home and save lives. But then what was interesting was it was largely enforced, by the Rwanda National Police, So it was not based on consent at all. It was, coercion. And then, of course, the other, let it not be me. In other countries, such as Kenya, not just Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and elsewhere, you had sort of this idea of what I call sort of data hoarding, What was interesting with the coverage of COVID was the fact that COVID news and related information was sort of reduced into a discourse of numbers. So a lot of the news about COVID was about, statistics on death or infection rates, rather than, the pandemic itself. And what then happened was that such data was almost without exception controlled by governments, okay? So governments had the ability to then either exaggerate or underplay the severity of infections or deaths depending on the prevailing political circumstances. So high numbers were given to the media to explain punitive sort of government interventions, and of course, when the political situation demanded it, that data was manipulated to demonstrate so that these interventions were actually working. And then, of course, you had a number of governments also investing heavily sort of in the digital information strategies, okay? So you had lots of sort of social media campaigns, use of Twitter handles, hashtags to communicate sort of state policy. the employment, of bots, for example, across, a number of countries, posting updates, infection rates, to rally, the public around their version of public health, messaging. In Kenya, for example, we had a very popular hashtag, Commercial Corona, which was funded, by the Ministry of Health, created for purposes of public information, but more crucially for information management, regarding the pandemic. A number of governments also launched, COVID apps, for contact tracing. But what happened was that a lot of these were used sort of for purposes of surveillance. So we created, a monster, in the name of public health sort of communication. I'll just conclude by noting that the control of public health information and its sort of enabling infrastructures, or what Binal calls or infopolitics, was indeed at the center of a number of governments' public health information response strategies. These approaches were used to fabricate or manufacture consent. Okay, so that consent was never there. It was fabricated and manufactured, and that these measures were enforced coercively, not just physically, but also discursively. Okay, we tend to always focus on the physical, the brutalization, of protesters, rather than sort of the discursive elements of public health sort of communication. And in my view, I think this failure provides us a very important opportunity, to reflect on what, for me, was a crucial misstep, in our handling of the pandemic, and hopefully, we need to rethink our ways of public health communication in Africa. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.